Her hands froze mid-pour. The glass trembled. Bourbon spilled across mahogany as she stared at the two men who'd just walked through the door. The scar. The cold eyes. The same faces from 8 years ago, the night they murdered her brother. Now they were here for someone else. She watched them position themselves behind the Mafia boss sitting at her bar. Professional. Patient. Predatory. He had no idea he had minutes to live. She could stay silent. Keep her head down. Survive another night like she'd done for 8 years. Or she could slip him one line. 5 words on a napkin. That would save his life and destroy everything she'd built to stay invisible. What she did next would change both their lives forever. Stay with me until the end, because this story will shake you to your core. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video. Hit subscribe and comment where you're watching from. Now let's get into it. It's a humid Friday evening in Manhattan's financial district, present day. The Velvet Room hummed with the usual crowd of well-dressed men conducting business over expensive bourbon and hushed conversations. This wasn't just any upscale lounge. This was neutral ground. Every bartender knew to keep their ears closed and their mouths shut. Every patron understood the unspoken rules. You minded your own business. You never asked questions. And you absolutely never caused a scene. Nyla Robinson stood behind that bar, a ghost in black serving drinks to ghosts in designer suits. At 26, she had perfected one essential skill over 3 years: invisibility. Her natural curls pulled back neat and professional. Her movements efficient and silent. Her face carefully blank. She mixed drinks. She smiled politely. She heard everything and remembered nothing. This was how Nyla survived. Methodical, careful, without emotion breaking through her mask. She had learned one fundamental truth the hard way. Speaking up got you killed, and silence kept you breathing. Luca DeSanto sat at his usual corner of the bar, a young king in a tailored black suit whose very presence commanded respect and caution in equal measure. At 34, he was one of the youngest-made bosses in the city's underworld. His dark eyes missed nothing. His word was final. And tonight, like every Friday for the past year, he was nursing his usual bourbon while conducting business on his phone in low, measured tones. The gold chain at his neck caught the amber bar lighting. The tattoo visible above his collar marked him as DeSanto family. Old blood, new power, dangerous either way. He had no idea someone in this room wanted him dead. But then something happened that would shatter the carefully constructed walls Nyla had built around her voice. The Velvet Room didn't just cater to the wealthy. It catered to the powerful who preferred to remain in the shadows. Here, beneath the low-slung amber lights of Manhattan's most discreet lounge, the air tasted of expensive cigars and heavy secrets. The walls were padded with emerald silk, dampening the sound of handshakes that decided the fate of docks, unions, and city council votes. At 26, Nyla Robinson had mastered the most difficult art in the room, the art of disappearing while standing in plain sight. She moved through the thicket of mahogany tables like a ghost in a cocktail dress. To the men in tailored Italian wool, she wasn't a person. She was a vessel for scotch and an empty ashtray. I hear everything and remember nothing, she reminded herself. A silent mantra that kept her pulse steady when a known cartel enforcer leaned too close to his associate, whispering about shipments in the Bronx. She didn't flinch when a stack of $100 bills changed hands near the service station. Her neutrality was her armor. If she was a shadow, she was safe. In this world, being noticed was usually a precursor to being used or being eliminated. Her routine was a clockwork of survival. She knew exactly which booth needed a fresh bottle of sparkling water before the guest even looked up, and which regulars required a silent nod instead of a greeting. Then there was Friday night. Friday meant the corner of the bar, the spot where the light didn't quite reach. Luca DeSanto was already there, a permanent fixture in a world of shifting allegiances. He sat with his back to the wall, a glass of bourbon neat sweating on the coaster. Luca didn't raise his voice, and he didn't need to. People came to him. They leaned in, their postures stiff with a mix of reverence and terror, while he listened with the stillness of a predator. Nyla approached, her steps silent on the plush carpet. She replaced his empty glass with a fresh one without a word. She didn't look at his eyes, focusing instead on the sharp line of his jaw and the way his fingers tapped a slow, rhythmic beat against the wood. This was the unspoken rule. She provided the fuel for the conversation, and in exchange, she was granted the mercy of being ignored. It was a delicate, suffocating prison of silence. She was the witness to 1,000 crimes, yet she existed on the periphery of life. As she turned away from Luca's table, the cold weight of the room pressed in on her. She was a professional. She was invisible. She was safe. But as the heavy bass of the lounge music thrummed in her chest, Nyla couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were beginning to close in. The atmosphere in the velvet room shifted the moment the door hummed open, admitting a draft of cold Manhattan air and two men who carried a different kind of darkness. Nyla was mid-pour, the gin cascading over a single olive, when she saw them. Victor, Viper, Kane, and Marco Bellini. Time didn't just slow, it curdled. Suddenly, the scent of expensive bourbon was replaced by the phantom stench of wet asphalt and garbage. Nyla wasn't in a silk-lined lounge anymore. She was 18 again, trembling behind a rusted dumpster in a rain-slicked alley. She was watching Terrence, her brother, who had only been looking for a shortcut home, plead for a life that wasn't theirs to take. She remembered the way Victor's mouth had quirked into a jagged smile before the flash of the muzzle. She remembered the silence that followed, heavier than any tomb. The martini glass in her hand wobbled. A drop of gin splashed onto her thumb, cold as ice, grounding her back to the present. Her hands began to shake with a violent, rhythmic tremor she couldn't suppress. Victor and Marco didn't head for a booth. They moved with a synchronized, predatory grace toward the corner of the bar, positioning themselves like bookends behind Luca DeSanto. They were patient, their expressions masks of professional indifference. To anyone else, they looked like associates waiting for a word. But Nyla saw the way Marco's hand hovered near his jacket lining, and how Victor pulled a phone from his pocket, his thumb hovering over the screen, waiting for the signal to drown out the music. Luca remained still, his gaze fixed on the amber liquid in his glass, entirely unaware that the ghosts of Nyla's past were about to become his executioners. Every survival instinct Nyla had cultivated over 8 years screamed at her to turn away. Hear everything, remember nothing. If she stayed silent, she stayed alive. If she walked to the kitchen, she could pretend she never saw the steel glinting beneath Marco's coat. But then she saw Terrence's face again, not the way he looked in the alley, but the way he had laughed that morning over breakfast. She looked at Victor, the man who had stolen her family and forced her into this life of shadows, and the neutrality that had been her armor for years finally shattered. The invisible girl felt a sudden, searing heat of agency. She couldn't save Terrence, but she was the only person in this crowded, oblivious room who could see the blade before it struck. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of war against her own fear. The transition from shadow to participant happened in the space between two heartbeats. Nyla's breath hitched, a jagged sound lost beneath the low thrum of jazz, as she reached beneath the bar for a cocktail napkin. Her fingers, usually so steady they could pour a perfect measure in a pitch-black room, fumbled with the pen. The two behind you. Contract. The ink bled slightly into the soft paper, looking like a bruise. Nyla folded it once, her pulse drumming a frantic, hollow rhythm against her collarbone. She felt the weight of Victor Kane's presence just feet away, a wolf standing behind a lion. Every cell in her body urged her to run, to let the cycle of violence spin on without her. But the phantom image of her brother's eyes wouldn't let her turn away. She stepped out from behind the mahogany fortress of the bar. The walk toward the corner booth felt miles long, the air turning thick and viscous like honey. She didn't look at Victor. She didn't look at Marco. She kept her eyes locked on the amber liquid in Luca DeSanto's glass, the only fixed point in a world that had suddenly tilted on its axis. As she reached him, she didn't speak. She couldn't have found her voice if she tried. With a hand that felt disconnected from her body, she lifted his half-empty glass to refresh the bourbon, sliding the folded napkin onto the coaster before setting the crystal back down. The silence that followed was deafening. Nyla stood there, a tray gripped white-knuckled against her hip, waiting for the world to end. For an agonizing second, Luca didn't react. He continued to stare ahead, his expression a mask of bored power. Then, his large, scarred hand shifted. His fingers closed around the napkin, pulling it flat against the table. He didn't tilt his head. He only dropped his gaze, his dark eyes scanning the 5 words she had offered as a shield. A microscopic ripple passed through his jaw, the only sign of the storm brewing beneath his skin. Then, he did something he had never done in the 3 years she had served him. He looked up. He didn't look at her as a fixture of the room or a ghost in a uniform. He looked at Nyla Robinson, piercing through her invisibility with a stare that felt like a physical weight. Why? The look asked. Why risk everything for me? Nyla didn't flinch. She held his gaze, her chin lifting just a fraction of an inch, offering her answer in the shared silence of the damned. She wasn't doing it for him. She was doing it because she was tired of being a ghost. Luca's eyes softened by a fraction of a degree, and he gave a nod so subtle it was almost imagined. The contract of her silence was broken, and the war had officially begun. The shift was instantaneous. Luca didn't rush. He stood with a predatory fluidity that signaled the end of the peace. With a sharp, 2-finger gesture toward the shadows near the kitchen, he signaled Carlo, his lead enforcer. The air in the room didn't just thicken, it caught fire. Victor Kane saw the movement, his eyes widening as he realized the element of surprise had evaporated. His hand vanished into the lining of his jacket, but Carlo was already a blur of motion, his weapon cleared and leveled before Victor could find his grip. Everybody down. Carlo's voice was a tectonic crack that shattered the lounge's curated elegance. Nyla didn't wait. She threw herself flat against the floorboards behind the heavy mahogany bar, just as the first round tore through the air. The sound was deafening, a percussive roar that turned the upscale sanctuary into a kill box. Above her, the back bar exploded. Thousands of dollars of rare bourbon and vintage gin rained down in a glittering, jagged downpour. The scent of high-proof alcohol and cordite filled her lungs, stinging her eyes as she curled into a ball, hands pressed over her ears. The room was a symphony of terror, the rhythmic crack-crack-crack of professional fire, the high-pitched shriek of heavy mirrors shattering, and the frantic thud of patrons scrambling for the exits. It lasted 15 seconds, a lifetime measured in heartbeats and falling glass. Then, a sudden, ringing silence fell. Nyla stayed tucked beneath the brass rail, her chest heaving, the shards of a broken decanter biting into her palms. She listened to the heavy, uneven breathing of men and the low moan of someone wounded. Slowly, she looked up. The velvet room was unrecognizable. Emerald silk walls were shredded, and the air was thick with a fine mist of dust and spirits. Victor Kane was slumped against a booth, clutching a bloody shoulder. His lethal arrogance bled dry. Marco Bellini lay face down on the carpet, Carlo's boot pressed firmly into the small of his back. A shadow fell over her. Nyla flinched, squinting through the haze. Luca DeSanto stood at the edge of the bar, looking down at her. He didn't have a hair out of place, though a spray of fine glass clung to the wool of his suit. He reached out, his large hand gripping the edge of the counter as he leaned over to bridge the distance between them. His eyes were no longer distant. They were burning with a terrifying, focused intensity. "You saved my life," he said, his voice a low, dangerous velvet that cut through the ringing in her ears. He didn't offer a hand to help her up. Not yet. "Now tell me why a girl who makes a living being invisible just put a target on her back for me." The transition from the wreckage of the lounge to the sterile, terrifying height of Luca's penthouse happened in a blur of black SUVs and hushed commands. Now, the roar of the city was reduced to a distant, shimmering carpet of lights beneath floor-to-ceiling glass. Nyla sat on the edge of a leather chair that felt too expensive to touch, her hands still trembling so violently that the ice in the glass Luca had pressed into her palm rattled like a warning. Luca didn't sit. He poured himself a double, the amber liquid glowing under the soft recessed lighting of his office. He didn't pressure her. He simply waited, his presence a heavy, grounding force in the center of the room. The words started as a trickle and then became a flood. Nyla told him about Terrence, about the rain-slicked alley, the smell of the dumpster, and the way the world had ended for an 18-year-old girl when she saw Victor Kane pull the trigger. She spoke of the 8 years she had spent shrinking into herself, terrified that a single look or a spoken word would alert the monsters that a witness still lived. "I watched them kill him for nothing," she whispered, her voice cracking for the first time. "I was too scared to be a sister then. I couldn't be a coward again. Not when I saw them standing behind you." Luca listened with a stillness that was almost unnatural. He didn't offer platitudes or comfort. He watched her with the clinical intensity of a man recalculating a complex equation. When she finished, he set his glass down on the mahogany desk with a soft thud. "Your brother was collateral damage in a world that doesn't care about innocence," Lucas said, his voice low and gravelly. "But tonight wasn't a random act of violence, Nyla. Victor and Marco are top tier. They don't take a run at someone like me without a mountain of cash and, more importantly, a map." He stepped closer, the city lights casting long, sharp shadows across his face. "They knew my Friday routine. They knew the blind spots in my security. They knew exactly where I'd be sitting. That doesn't happen without a leak. Someone in my inner circle, someone I trust, opened the door for them." The adrenaline that had been keeping Nyla upright turned into a cold, leaden dread. "I thought I was just stopping a murder," she breathed. "You did," Luca replied, his eyes narrowing. "But you also interrupted a coup. Those men saw your face. Whoever hired them will know exactly who broke the silence. By saving my life, you forfeited the one thing that kept you safe." He leaned in, his shadow eclipsing her. "You aren't invisible anymore, Nyla. You're the only witness to a betrayal, and in my world, that's a death sentence." The warehouse smelled of stagnant river water and rusted iron, a brutal contrast to the silk-lined luxury of the penthouse. Nyla stood in the center of the concrete floor, her breath hitching as the harsh overhead lights caught the bruised faces of Victor and Marco. They were strapped to steel chairs, stripped of their weapons and their arrogance. For 8 years, these men had been the titans of her nightmares. Now, they were just bleeding men in a cold room. Luca didn't use a blade or a hammer. He paced the perimeter of the light, his voice a low, rhythmic purr that was far more terrifying. He spoke of family, of debt, and of the excruciatingly slow ways a human body could fail. "Who gave you the schedule?" Luca asked, his voice like grinding stones. "Who told you the side entrance was unbolted?" Victor spat blood onto the concrete, his eyes darting to Nyla. He recognized her now. The girl from the bar, the girl from the alley. "You should have stayed a ghost, sweetheart," he wheezed. Then, under the weight of Luca's shadow, his resolve fractured. It was Caruso. Dante said it was time for a change of management. He's been talking to the Rossinis for months. The hit was supposed to be clean. A random shooting in a crowded bar. No fingerprints. The silence that followed was like permafrost settling over the room. Dante Caruso had been at Luca's side for a decade. He was the godfather to Luca's nephew. Nyla watched Luca's face. It didn't twist in anger. It simply went hollow, his features setting into a mask of lethal, focused stone. "Dante's already cleaning house, Luca," Marco added, a jagged, desperate laugh bubbling in his throat. "He knows a girl from the bar tipped you off. He saw the security footage from across the street. He doesn't like loose ends, especially ones with families." The world tilted. Nyla's heart didn't just race. It slammed against her ribs with a sickening force. Her mind flew to the small dorm room uptown, to the girl who was the only light left in her darkened world. "Maya," Nyla whispered, the name a jagged plea. "My sister. Maya's at Columbia. She has late labs on Tuesdays. She didn't have to finish." Luca was already moving, his phone out, his thumb flying across the screen with a speed that spoke of a life lived in the crosshairs. "Carlo," Luca barked into the receiver, his eyes locked on Nyla's trembling form. "Change of plans. Get a team to Columbia University immediately. Locate Maya Robinson. I don't care what it takes or who you have to go through. Protective custody. Bring her to the safe house. Move." He ended the call, and turned back to Nyla. The distance between them was gone. He reached out, his hand steadying her shoulder, his grip the only thing keeping her from collapsing. "The game has changed," he said. "They're coming for everything you love. From this moment on, you don't leave my side." The sirens in the distance were a low, mournful howl, but the violence on Columbia's campus had been surgical and swift. Carlo's call came through with the clipped efficiency of a soldier. Maya was secure. Dante's crew had arrived at the dormitory 3 minutes too late, met not by a defenseless student, but by the cold muzzle of a DeSanto vanguard. In the sterilized silence of a high-security safe house, Nyla finally pulled her sister into her arms. Maya was shaking, her oversized university sweatshirt damp with cold sweat, her eyes wide with a terror Nyla knew all too well. While they clung to each other in the back room, the floorboards above them seemed to groan under the weight of a collapsing empire. Luca was upstairs, tearing the rot out of his organization. The fracture was total. Men who had broken bread for years were now drawing lines in the dirt, choosing between the traditional loyalty of the DeSantos or the ambitious treachery of Dante Caruso. An hour later, Luca entered the room. His jacket was gone, his shirt sleeves rolled up, and his expression was weary but resolute. He laid out the reality with the cold precision of a surgeon. "I can get you both out," Lucas said, his gaze lingering on Nyla. "I have the reach to put you in the wind before the sun comes up. New names, new cities, a life where nobody knows your face. Witness protection without the government's red tape. You can run, Nyla. You can finally be safe." Maya's hand tightened on Nyla's arm, her voice a frantic whisper. "Nyla, please. Let's just go. We can start over. We can forget all of this." Nyla looked at her sister, then at the man who had spent his life in the shadows she had only recently stepped out of. She thought of the 8 years she had spent as a ghost, the decade of swallowing her own tongue while her brother's killers walked the streets. She thought of the velvet silence of the lounge and the way it had felt like a shroud. "If we run, we're always running," Nyla said, her voice finding a sudden, crystalline clarity. "Dante will always be behind us. Victor and Marco will eventually find another way out. And Terrence." She paused, her heart steadying for the first time since the alley. "Terrence deserves the truth to be told." She stepped away from the safety of her sister's embrace, moving toward the center of the room. 8 years ago, I stayed silent, and it nearly destroyed me. I'm not doing that again. I'm not going back into the shadows." She met Luca's burning gaze with a defiance that shifted the air between them. "I'll testify. I'll give you everything I saw in that alley and everything I saw tonight. I'm done being invisible." The velvet room was a skeleton of its former self. The scent of spilled bourbon and stale gunpowder hung in the air, a bitter reminder of the peace that had been shattered. Piles of broken glass had been swept into the corners, and the emerald silk walls were jagged and torn. It was here, amidst the ruins of his empire, that Luca called the meeting. Dante Caruso entered with the practiced confidence of a man who believed his lies were impenetrable. He was flanked by 4 loyalists, their eyes scanning the dark corners, but Dante's focus was on Luca, who sat alone at a central table. "It's a tragedy, Luca," Dante said, his voice dripping with feigned sympathy. "To see our home like this. We'll find who did this. We'll make the Rossinis bleed for it." "The Rossinis didn't do this, Dante," Lucas said, his voice a low, terrifying vibration. "You did." Dante froze, his face a mask of wounded innocence. "You're under a lot of stress." "That hit." "The hit failed because someone spoke," Luca interrupted. He looked toward the bar. "Tell him, Nyla." Nyla stepped out from the shadows of the service station. She wasn't ducking or trembling. She was standing behind the mahogany counter, the amber light catching the sharp line of her shoulders. She looked Dante directly in the eye, the man who had ordered her sister's death. "Victor Kane broke in 10 minutes, she said, her voice steady and cold. "He told us everything. The contract, the schedule, the Rossini deal. The bluff collapsed." Dante's expression curdled into something ugly and feral. "You're going to take the word of a waitress over mine." He reached for his jacket, his voice rising in a desperate snarl. I built half of this family. You think you could just cast me out over a girl's story? You sent men after an innocent woman and her sister to cover your ambition, Lucas said, rising slowly from his chair. You don't get to negotiate. The room erupted. Dante's men drew their weapons, but Luca's loyalists were already positioned in the darkness. The gunfire was sharp and deafening, echoing off the empty bottles. Nyla didn't dive for cover this time. She stayed on her feet, her eyes tracking the movements in the room she knew better than anyone. As Dante scrambled for the service exit, Nyla grabbed a heavy brass rail used to lock the bar shutters and jammed it into the track of the heavy, sliding door. The door caught with a metallic scream, trapping Dante in the open. Carlo! The service lane, she shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. Alerted by her call, Luca's men closed the perimeter. The struggle was brutal and brief. When the final echo of gunfire faded, Dante Caruso lay still on the checkered floor he had tried to claim as his own. Luca walked over to the bar, his chest heaving. He looked at the brass rail Nyla still held, then up at her. For the first time, the weight of the past seemed to lift from her shoulders. She wasn't just a witness anymore. She was the one who had closed the door. The velvet room had been reborn. The emerald silk was gone, replaced by deep, obsidian velvet that absorbed the light rather than reflecting it. The scent of gunpowder had been scrubbed away, replaced by the crisp, clean aroma of cedar and high-end rye. It was Friday night, and the room hummed with its signature discreet energy, but the hierarchy had shifted at its very foundation. Nyla stood behind the bar, her hands steady as she polished a crystal glass. She still wore the tailored dark dress, but she was no longer a ghost haunting the periphery. She was the anchor. Over the last 3 months, her role had evolved from serving drinks to serving as the organization's most vital asset. She spent her days teaching Luca's men the nuances of the invisible, how to read the twitch of a lip, the subtle shift in a patron's posture, and the way a lie sounds before it's even spoken. Her observational skills, once her prison, were now her greatest weapon. Justice had been a slow, grinding process, but a final one. Nyla had stood in a brightly lit courtroom and stared down Victor Kane and Marco Bellini. She had spoken Terrence's name into a microphone, her voice echoing through the chambers until the weight of her silence was finally transferred to them. They were gone now, buried in the state system for life, and for the first time in 8 years, Nyla could breathe without a phantom hand around her throat. The door chimes signaled a new arrival, and Nyla's expression softened. Maya walked in, her backpack slung over one shoulder and a bright, confident smile on her face. She spent her weekends here now, no longer the terrified girl from the dorms, but a sister proud of the woman who had burned down her own life to save them both. As Maya found a seat at a booth, Nyla turned to the corner of the bar. Luca was already there. He sat in the same shadow-drenched spot, but the air between them had changed. It was no longer a transaction of service and silence. It was a partnership forged in fire. Nyla poured a double of his preferred bourbon, the amber liquid catching the light as she set it before him. She didn't walk away this time. She leaned against the back bar, meeting his gaze with a quiet, earned equality. "The man in the third booth," she murmured, her eyes flicking toward a newcomer in a charcoal suit. "He's carrying a grudge and a recording device." Luca took a slow sip, his eyes never leaving hers. "I'll have Carlo handle it quietly. Anything else?" "Nothing I can't handle," she replied. They had built something neither of them had expected, a bridge of trust in a world built on betrayal. Nyla Robinson had learned that speaking wasn't just about making noise. It was about reclaiming the power that silence had stolen. She wasn't invisible anymore, and as she looked at Luca, she realized she had never been more seen.